All right, if you would, this evening, turn with me to the book of 2 Kings, chapter 4. I forgot to mention, but I have in here the prayer card from the funeral of my coworker Liz. Do remember them as well as she lost her father. Again, like I said, holiday season, especially difficult, especially first holiday, any holiday though, without your loved one. It's an especially difficult time, so please do remember her in prayer if you come to your mind. All right, 2 Kings chapter 4, starting in verse 1. Now there cried a certain woman of the wives of the sons of the prophets unto Elisha, saying, Thy servant, thy husband is dead, and thou knowest that thy servant did fear the Lord, and the creditor is come to take unto him my 2 sons to be bondmen. And Elisha said unto her, What shall I do for thee? Tell me, what hast thou in the house? And she said, Thine handmaid hath not anything in the house, save a pot of oil. Then he said, Go borrow thee vessels abroad of all thy neighbors, even empty vessels, borrow not a few. And when thou art come in, thou shalt shut the door upon thee and upon thy sons, and shalt pour out into all those vessels, and thou shalt set aside that which is full. So she went from him, and shut the door upon her and upon her sons, who brought the vessels to her, and she poured out. And it came to pass, when the vessels were full, that she said unto her son, Bring me yet a vessel. And he said unto her, There is not a vessel more, and the oil stayed. Then she came and told the man of God, and he said, Go sell the oil, and pay thy debt, and live thou and thy children off the rest. So we're going to speak this evening on Elisha and the widow's oil, a story that we're fairly well acquainted with, I think most of us, but not something that we necessarily look at all the time, so I want to take a look at it a little bit this evening. Hopefully it'll be a blessing to all of us. So we see here in verse 1 that this widow woman cries to Elisha in her distress. We know the widow had faith because she cried to Elisha. This crying out meant that she was in trouble. Hard times had obviously, as we read about here, hard times had fallen upon her. And in her pain and uncertainty, she was in desperate need of help. Now, in the Old Testament, this crying out was ultimately directed to the Lord. It was an urgent prayer for heavenly aid. Yet, though these cries went through an agent, an intermediary, and the usual mediator in those times was the king. If you stumbled into desperate need, you petitioned the king. And we've read examples of that throughout the Old Testament. But that was the usual way of obtaining help in a dire need, in a dire situation, such as this widow woman was in. The king was the Lord's servant. He was the one appointed to give relief. The widow, however, here in 2 Kings 4, bypasses the king and goes directly to the prophets. In this case, we don't know exactly. Believe the king was likely a wicked king. And so she bypassed the wicked king, and she sought out a true agent of the Lord. And in her case, there was none greater in her day than Elisha. Again, we see here the third word of chapter 4, verse 1, cried. This cry, again, indicates anguish and pain. We all know what it means to cry. But again, words are very important. It doesn't just say that this widow went and asked Elisha. It doesn't even say that she pleaded. It says that she cried to him. Imagine the pain and grief this woman must have been feeling to be driven to cry out in this way. Think about your own life. Have you ever been driven to such distress? If not, praise the Lord. But if you have, remember that feeling of complete hopelessness. And that's what this widow woman is feeling at this moment. Remember, this is something that I think about all the time, and I try to remind myself frequently when we're reading any part of the Bible. But the people on these pages, the people that we're reading about here, were real people. They were human beings with skin and bones and muscles. They felt hunger and pain and sorrow just like us. They're a few thousand years apart from us, But these were real human beings. Sometimes it's easy to read through these stories and just think of them, even though we know it's not a fairy tale and we know in our mind that these were true events, it's easy to think of them as just characters in a story. But remember, these were true people with real emotions that we're reading about here. This is a woman who had just lost her husband. Now, of course, we all know the patriarchal society that existed in the Old Testament. This woman, not only has she lost her husband, her life partner, the one that she loved and the one that loved her more than anyone else, her closest friend, but she has also lost her economic security. And now she is about to not only lose her sons as well, but lose them to slavery. And I'm sure this woman, and I say this just because I'm a parent as well, most of us here are parents, but I'm sure this woman would much rather be herself sold into slavery than to have her sons experience that degradation. But this is the situation she is in. Her husband is dead. She owes a debt well beyond what she can pay. Her sons are on the cusp of being taken from her and subjected to slavery. Any hope of seeing her children marry and have grandchildren will be taken away with her sons. And once her sons are gone, she will likely starve to death herself. As she says here in verse 2, that all she has in the house is a pot of oil. Now, she can live on that for a little while, but it's not going to last very long. That's all she has. This woman hadn't always been desperately poor, leading such a tragic life. This is another mistake that I think we make when we see people. We tend to think that the situation they're in now, it's hard for us to imagine them in a different situation. But we'll get back to that in a second. As the wife of a prophet, as it says that this woman was, she would have been a respected member of her community, and she would have been taken care of financially. I'm sure she wasn't wealthy, but she was taken care of. She had her basic needs taken care of. She had a home, she had food. She had stability. As humans, there's not a whole lot more that we crave than stability. We see it even in small children that grow up in horrible circumstances. I'm sure all of us have seen it at some point in our lives. But what they really crave is stability. Children need stability. That's not something that goes away, though, when we turn 18 or some other magical age. Stability is something that we all need. There's nothing wrong with that. That is the way God has made us. We desire stability. Now, of course, what we put our trust in for our stability, that's a different discussion. But that's not where we're going to go right now. This woman had stability, but like Job, that we all know the story of Job, it has all disappeared. When we see someone suffering, as I mentioned earlier, it is important to remember that they likely haven't always been in that condition. Their current situation shouldn't define who they are as a person in our eyes. Most people experiencing homelessness haven't been homeless their whole lives. At some point, they may have had a good job, a good home, and for whatever reason, they're now in this situation, just like this woman here. But again, as human beings, especially if we don't have enough compassion in our hearts, sometimes we just see them like, oh, well, they're a homeless person. Or, oh, this is a woman that just, she can't take care of her sons and she's about to lose her sons. But that's not the life that she had always had. And so it's the same thing in our lives as well. The person using an EBT card or whatever it may be in front of us at the grocery store, that person as well might have been well paid and had great stability before. We all tend to think that we are above poverty, but in reality, none of us are. I mean, the Bible teaches us that. I mean, none of us in this church are anything above middle class. Job was an extremely wealthy man, one of the most wealthy men of his day, and he was reduced to nothing. And not only financially, we know, of course, that he also lost his family as well. But we lose sight, so easily of whose hand all things come from. We trust in ourselves, even though we say we believe all things come from God. We believe we're above, we're too good for truly difficult or embarrassing situations. And in doing so, of course, we dishonor God. We rob God of credit and the praise for that, which is ultimately due him. Another thing to note about this woman's situation here in 2 Kings chapter 4, society had also failed her. Under the covenant laws, enslavement for debt would not have happened if things were done according to God's plan, according to God's law. Disallowing such abuses was one responsibility of a godly, responsible relative, a redeemer, like we read about in Ruth. We're familiar with the redeemer in that story. Or even it was even the responsibility, as I mentioned earlier, of the king himself. These safety nets put in place by God had failed her, not due to God, of course, or any shortcomings of him, but due to the failures of the people and the society in which she lived. This is, of course, due to sin and something that continues to this day. As a society, we usually try to have some safety nets to help people, but all too often the most vulnerable still fail to receive the help that they need, just like this widow. And again, that is due to sin in our societies. And it's not a United States thing, and it's not an Israel thing. It's a human thing. It exists everywhere throughout the world. There is no perfect place or no perfect society or any perfect people. We won't experience that until we get to heaven. So we don't know if this widow had already appealed to the king and the king refused to help, if she had no family that could step in as a redeemer. All we know from our text here is that her situation is seemingly hopeless. From human eyes, the prognosis is horrible. Like I said, her children, her sons, are about to be sold into slavery, and likely she's going to starve to death. That is the way things are in front of her. Again, her situation appears hopeless. And hopelessness is an absolutely awful feeling. Now, it is true that Brother Keller used to tell the joke, and not really a joke, but someone said, oh, things are horrible. It's so bad that, we've had to just trust on the Lord. Oh, is it that bad? Unfortunately, there's a lot of truth in that, and we tend to not turn to God right away until it's our absolute last resort. And that is, of course, not the way that it should be, but hopelessness, one of the absolute worst emotions that we can bear as human beings. That's where this woman, and likely her sons too. Again, this passage doesn't really focus on the sons too much. It speaks of them. It tells what they have done, and it tells what is going to happen to them if the situation does not change. But I mean, they know that they're about to be sold into slavery. I'm sure they're not in a great mood. They probably feel hopeless, just like their mother, and they know that if they get sold into slavery, their mother's probably going to die, and they'll never get to see her again. So hopelessness was not just confined to this widow woman. It had overtaken this household. Hopelessness can come on any of us. But if hopelessness visits us, let us remember the lessons of this widow woman. She didn't curl up in a ball, as can be so tempting in times of despair. She went to God's man. She went to God. She went to the Redeemer. She cried unto Elisha and told him of her desolation. It's easy when we read this passage, 2 Kings 4, 1 through 7. It's easy for us to focus on verses 2 through 6. After all, that's where we get to the juicy stuff. We see the miracle, and if that's usually, every Bible is different, but a lot of times, that's, what it'll say, the miracle of the widow's oil or something to that effect. But let us not be guilty of the same attitude as the followers of Jesus in his day that only followed to see a good show and to fill their stomachs. Remember, Jesus rebuked them for that, and I don't believe any of those people were saved. They were just there for the show and for food, but we can be guilty of that as well. So even when we look at this passage, let us not just focus on the miracle, but let us look at the whole story. Our desire ought to be to glean wisdom from these passages, and not all, but a decent portion of the wisdom in this passage is set up in verse 1. Most importantly, where she turned. Or more importantly, more accurately, to whom she turned. Don't be confused by the fact that she turned to Elisha, a man. She went to God through his appointed intercessor at that time. This is the most important takeaway from this story. The point of this story is not just that God can take a little oil and turn it into a little bit more oil. If you only take away one thing from this, let it be that before verses 2 through 7 happen, this woman, in her sorrow, turned to God. That is the lesson for us. Turn to God. Verses 2 through 7 are an encouragement, of course, and they're a historical record. They're there to remind us of God's provision in his capability to provide for us even in the darkest hours. But verse 1 is what we ought to do. Oftentimes we skip verse 1 in our lives. We want to skip ahead to verses 6 and 7 in particular. But for verses 6 and 7 to happen, we have to first experience verse 1. There is no need for a redeemer without pain, without want, without a need. There is no miracle where no need is present. As we've said before, growth happens most often in the valleys of life. Now, no one likes the valleys. We all prefer the mountaintops, of course. But the next time you're in a valley, don't just sit around waiting for verses 6 and 7 to happen to you. Get to verse 1. Cry to the Lord. Only then can we begin to experience the blessings of the Redeemer. At this point, I want to shift our attention a bit and take a look at the reaction and actions of the other people in this story. So in verse 2, starting in verse 2, we read Elisha's reaction. Verse 2, we'll read it again. Elisha said unto her, What shall I do for thee? Tell me, what hast thou in the house? And she said, Thine handmaid hath not anything in the house, save a pot of oil. Now, at first glance, this seems like a pretty unremarkable, straightforward response to this woman's cry in verse 1. But I want to draw your attention most to what is not in his response. And that mainly is judgment. This woman had borrowed money after the death of her husband and is now not able to pay her debt. But Elisha doesn't question her financial savvy in procuring loans or upbraid her for her inability to meet her obligations. He doesn't ask her how she has squandered what she had. He doesn't ask her if she has gone out and tried to find work or reprimand her for not working a little bit harder. Elisha didn't ask why her extended family wasn't meeting her obligations, to assist her. He didn't ask if she had been to see the king. He simply asked, What shall I do for thee? What shall I do for thee? When we hear someone is having a difficulty, what is our first thought? I believe our first thought when approached for help, or when we hear of someone that has a particular need, I believe our first thought is a barometer of our heart health. It's a good way to gauge our spiritual wellness. If our first thought is anything other than, what shall I do for thee? We need to take a closer look at our spiritual health, at our heart. We all reach for judgment first sometimes. If being 100% honest, I find myself doing it, and I try to immediately recalibrate and put myself in the right direction and have caring thoughts and see how I can assist. But that isn't always my first thought, and I'm guessing I'm not the only one. It's a good thing that we recognize that we need to stop judging and try to assist, but assistance and what shall I do for thee ought to be our first response, our first thought in our mind. Verse 3, then he said, Go borrow thee vessels abroad of all thy neighbors, even empty vessels, borrow not a few. The next subject I want to look at in this story seemingly has the smallest role, but without whom verses 6 and 7 also don't happen, and that is the neighbors. Similarly to Elisha, we don't read of this woman's neighbors questioning her for being in this position in the first place. They simply gave what they could. And what they gave was fairly simple. They gave empty pots, empty vessels, whatever they had. The woman didn't ask, she wasn't instructed to ask, for vessels full of oil. Perhaps her neighbors had oil to spare, but that wasn't the instruction from God. All she was asking for was empty containers. That's it. Perhaps the widow thought that it would have made more sense to ask her neighbors for oil, but God, through Elisha, had her request empty vessels. 2 notes about this. 1, God blesses us immensely by including us in his provision, in the miracles of provision. Similar to salvation, God doesn't have to use us as human beings to accomplish his will of salvation. He does so that we may share in the blessings and be reminded of his miraculous provision. 2, a simple thing can be used of God to accomplish amazing things. The widow didn't know yet at this point what these vessels were going to be used for. So the neighbors definitely didn't know. As far as they knew, they were just loaning their neighbor a pot. When we do simple things for God, for others, God can take it and multiply it infinitely, like the loaves and the fishes. God just asks that we have a giving heart. That's what it's all about. It's not what we actually have to offer God. We have nothing that God does not have. God just asks that we have a willing heart, and he then takes the insignificant things that we have to offer, an empty pot, a loaf of bread, and a few fishes, and uses them for miraculous things. And what an encouragement that is. Let this encourage us to find small ways to be a blessing to others. After all, we don't know how God will use even the smallest of offerings to accomplish great and mighty things. Verse 4, and when thou art come in, thou shalt shut the door upon thee and upon thy sons, and shalt pour out into all those vessels, and thou shalt set aside that which is full. So she went from him and shut the door upon her and upon her sons, who brought the vessels to her, and she poured out. I'm not going to spend much time on it, but another way, in my experience, probably the most common way to teach this passage is to focus on the empty vessels. And to be filled by God, of course, we must first be emptied of all else. That is absolutely true. Next, we see Elisha orders her to shut the doors behind her, which may seem like a strange request. So what is the point of this direction? Well, the step is an allusion to a law in Deuteronomy 24, 10 through 11. We won't read it at this time, but in Deuteronomy 24, 10 and 11, it says that a creditor cannot enter your house to seize the pledge. Instead, you have to bring the pledge outside to the creditor. Remember, in this story, the creditor is on his way, and the pledge of this loan is the widow's children. If he finds them outside, he can legally confiscate her sons. But inside, under the law, they are safe. So Elisha makes them come inside, shut the doors, to follow this law and to protect her sons. With the door shut, this buys her time to save them. And time is precisely what this widow is going to need, as Elisha then tells her to take the flask and start filling up each borrowed container one at a time. This is a slow-paced miracle. Many of the miracles that we have recorded in the Word of God are instantaneous. The healing miracles of Christ, Christ would say, stand up and walk, and they were immediately healed. This is not a case like that. This is a slow-moving miracle. The widow, of course, obeys the command of Elisha. Her children, her sons, bring her a vessel. She fills it, she puts it aside, and that's replaced with an empty one. If you think about it, this has got to be one of the slowest miracles recorded in the Word of God. She is pouring from a flask. Surely the output is not that fast. Maybe she gets a gallon per minute, maybe less. She collected some 50, 100 or more containers. We don't know. With this slow dribble, the widow is filling buckets, canning jars, tubs, and gallon jugs, whatever she was able to get from her neighbors. This could have taken days. Nevertheless, with the last container up to the brim, the oil stops flowing. We can just picture the widow and her kids, exhausted and oily, sitting in a house that is just absolutely crammed with vessels of oil. So she went from him and shut the door behind herself and her sons. In verse 5, who brought the vessels to her, and she poured out. And it came to pass, when the vessels were full, that she said unto her son, bring me yet a vessel. And he said unto her, there is not a vessel more, and the oil stayed. Then she came and told the man of God, and he said, go sell the oil and pay the debt, and live thou and thy children of the rest. This woman's needs have been met. The creditor also received his payment. The law has been fulfilled. Relief has been granted to the widow and her sons. The widow had faith, turned to God, and had her needs met in a miraculous way. Lastly, I want to tie this event to the holiday of Thanksgiving that we celebrate tomorrow in this country. I'm sure the widow woman never forgot this miracle. I mean, how could you? And of course, it is saved as a record for all that have come after her for thousands and thousands of years now. We don't know what happened in her life after this day, or the lives of her sons, but we do know that their paths were forever altered by the provision of God. Perhaps she was able to help someone else in need and be the neighbor in the story later on in her life. Certainly her sons never forgot the miracle either. Again, they were on the cusp of being slaves. But their mother turned to God, and their descendants got to bask in the blessings. When we turn to God, when we honor God, when we serve God, we are an example to our children, and we become a memorial for our families. Thank God for the blessings that flow from the faith of previous generations. And that's not just limited to those of us that had the blessing of being raised in homes with godly parents, because not all of us were placed in that situation by God's will. But we still, even those of us that haven't had that blessing, we still receive the after effects, the reverberations of those blessings, those faith-filled moments for years and years, decades and decades to come as a member of a church, as a member of a faith community. And today, of course, our physical blessings rarely take such an overtly miraculous form. But when we sit down at our respective Thanksgiving tables tomorrow, what lies before us will be no less of a miracle than the oil of this widow woman. As we gather and give thanks, let us not lose sight of the source of all blessings and the miracles that surround us every day. Mom, if you'd come, let's all stand.